Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. We are excited to host our next college prep webinar, Test Optional. Is it really an option? And we have a special guest speaker here that will talk to us more about that. Just a few housekeeping tips as we get started. All of our participants are on mute. And if you do have a question that comes to mind during the webinar, there's a Q&A feature, a little button at the bottom that you can click on, and that'll be your way to ask a question. If you have difficulty with this feature, we'll give you an option for sending an email towards the end of this webinar. Please do not use the chat function, as we will use that to share links and information with you instead of questioning. So we're excited to get started tonight. This webinar is part of the Virtual Christian College Fair sponsored by NACAP and Find Your Christian College. The virtual platform is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week from now until the end of November. But tonight, after this college prep webinar is complete, there will be college reps waiting in the booths. So you're welcome to go in and chat with people and get some more information about the great schools that are part of Find Your Christian College. As I said, from now until the end of the month, we'd love for you to join us. And I'd love to introduce you to our featured speaker tonight, Caryn Thexton, who's the Director of College Counseling at Trinity Christian Academy in Addison, Texas. A longtime college rep with great information, and she's going to talk to us about test optional admissions. Welcome, Caryn.
Thank you. All right, so let's talk about test optional admissions. Is it really an option? This is something that students and parents are continue to wonder about as they are reading information online, seeing the news. Is test optional? When colleges say they're test optional, do they really mean that? So what we're going to talk about tonight, first of all, is the question. Many colleges aren't required SAT or ACT for admissions. So how, as a family, as students and parents, how do you determine whether or not to submit test scores? And then if you come to the conclusion that we're not going to submit test scores, what other factors could be considered in a college application? What should students keep in mind that they want to maybe highlight or share with colleges to make them a standout applicant? So let's define test optional. Test optional has been around for a long time. Before 2020, there were lots of schools that were test optional, but just for a definition, this policy, if a school has a test optional policy, it leaves the decision up to the students to determine whether they want to send SAT scores or ACT scores or CLT scores to a college. In other words, colleges don't require students to submit test scores for admission. So before sending scores, students should reflect on whether their test results accurately represent their academic ability and potential. There's a few definitions, test optional. It's up to the student. There's some schools that are currently test flexible. So they usually will require you to send test scores, but they might have some different options in place instead of the SAT, ACT, or the CLT. They might say, you don't have to submit a test score if you hit a certain GPA requirement, or you might be able to submit AP scores or IB scores instead of test SAT, ACT test scores. So test flexible. And then some schools are test blind now, and test blind means that they won't look at a test score. They won't look at an ACT or SAT. So even if a student got a perfect score on one of these tests, it's not considered in the admissions process. There's some real pros to test optional. It gives a college or university the opportunity to look at a student holistically as a human being rather than just a number. Test scores focus on a snapshot in time. So if you think about that Saturday morning when your student went to the school at 7:30 to take an ACT or an SAT, that's a point in time, how that student woke up, how were they feeling? Did they feel energetic? Were they tired? Were they irritated? That's a snapshot of how they were feeling at that moment and how they perform in the test, where grades are a way of looking historically over 4 years or 3 years. This is how a student has maintained classwork, and it's more than just one moment in time. The cons though, especially at the beginning of 2020, 2021, the test optional standards were for shared admissions were still being developed. So if you were maybe had some older kids who applied to certain schools and you knew, oh, we have to get a particular test score in order to be admitted with the shared admissions. Those are still test optional is not always as clean cut as that. So the standards for shared admissions for test optional students are still developing. For test optional, especially earlier in the test optional introduction, the scholarship requirements can sometimes be more challenging to determine. So it might be harder to figure out scholarship, whereas a few years ago, you used to be able to just input your GPA and test score and figure out, oh, I'm going to get this much scholarship money. So that can be a little bit of a challenge at some schools. And then if you have spent a lot of time and money on test prep, that would be a con, because maybe that's something that you want to make sure that you're taking advantage of. And, you have worked hard, your student has worked hard to improve a test score, and maybe test optional makes that feel a little bit like time or money that you didn't spend, that didn't have purpose. So how do you decide? So you, as a parent, are trying to help your student determine whether to submit a test score. The first point is to read the school's stated testing policy. They vary from school to school, and it varies widely. So here are a few testing policies that pulled from some admissions websites, and we'll talk about this kind of category. So the first school says the decision to suspend our testing requirements was in response to the pandemic. Our suspension for now is temporary. So this school's verbiage is really saying, like, we're just doing this for a little while. We're not embracing this wholeheartedly. Now they might change their tune, but at this point, they're reflecting, this is just temporary. We're not going to keep this forever. The next test optional terminology, those who have ACT scores or SAT scores are welcomed, encouraged to submit them. So they're saying, hey, if you have them, we'd love for you to see them. And then those who have test scores from other standardized exams may submit those. I've seen on a specific college's admissions website that if you couldn't take the test, if you don't have test scores from an official ACT or SAT, we'll look at your PSAT scores, just send those in too. That just has an underlying message of, we really, really want to see test scores. I just looked at some verbiage that I didn't have time to put into this presentation today, that the school said, if a student is unable to secure a test, if they're unable to sit for a test, then we could consider them as test optional. So that's really pointing back to the times in 2020 when test sites were closed down, students couldn't sit for a test. But what they're saying is, if you can't sit for this test, if you are unable to secure a testing location, sure, you can be test optional. But that really is reflecting that their wish or desire is for a student to submit test scores. Or if they say something like, this policy, our test optional policy, has contributed to a significant increase in applications. What test optional has done in some cases, especially at very selective schools, if a school says they're test optional and it's a very selective school, a lot more people think, well, if my test scores aren't going to hold me back, I'm just going to go ahead and apply. If a school is telling you, hey, we have a whole lot more applications now that we're test optional, it's going to be to the student's advantage to work towards getting a high test score. So that's a real telltale sign. Hey guys, we've got lots more applications. We don't know what we're getting a lot of people taking advantage of test optional. If they're getting more applications, then a test score could probably be more important to that school. So these are some schools that the underlying message is, we are test optional, but maybe we're not as test optional as you might think. And we'll talk about, like, okay, now that you see this, what next? So some other test optional policies. This is one taken from a school that's a Find My Christian College website. While XYZ's university process is test optional, consideration of your scores may benefit you. At the same time, submitting your scores will never negatively affect your application of financial aid. So they're telling you right up front, hey, it's optional. It might benefit you, but we're gonna make sure it's not gonna hurt you. And I think this is a very clear message that we're only gonna look at your test scores if they benefit you. It's a gift for them to have this on their test optional website because they are being upfront and honest. We're not gonna let it hurt you. And then this other college terminology, it says we want to support our future students and ease the application process. So they're saying, we understand it's stressful. They're optional. We recommend you take a test for more scholarship opportunities, but we will look holistically. We'll look at the whole student and consider all submitted application items when making a admissions and scholarship decision. So again, they're pointing out, we know this is stressful. We recommend that you take them, but we're going to look at the whole picture. This is assuring to the students that they are going to support the student in their decision to be test optional, if that's the case. So you've read the admissions website, and maybe you have a more clear picture. Maybe it's just as confusing. So then we look at the numbers. So if your student has a practice test score, so if your student has taken a PSAT or a pre-ACT, or if they have taken the test, the SAT or the ACT, then we look at the school's stated average, which is found on the admissions website. So if this school has an average between a 1015 and a 1230 on the SAT, if my test scores are up in that higher range, so if I've gotten on the SAT at 1220, 1230, 1240, I'm at the high end, then I probably am going to want to submit a test score because that's going to help me. If my ACT is a 27, 28, 29, that's going to tell me that I'm right in line with some of the top testers. So a test score is going to help me. If I have a really strong application, if I'm a good student with good grades, but I'm just not test taking is not my strength, and maybe I have an 850 and 900. Maybe for this particular university, if they're test optional, then I'm not going to submit my test scores. I'm going to take advantage of this because that test score is a point in time. It's a Saturday morning that is only one piece of who I am. And so I'm going to not submit a test score if a school is offering that test optional. So you've looked at the stated policy, you reviewed the numbers, and then you ask the admissions counselor. So admissions counselors are your resource to help you navigate the test optional landscape. My experience when talking with admissions counselors that are at test optional schools, you can ask them, hey, we're trying to determine whether to submit a test score. Can you give us some guidance? They'll either say something like the first school that says, it's not going to hurt you, go ahead and submit it. Or they might not have the ability to comment. Well, maybe just look at our numbers and make a decision. But if a school really is embracing that test optional mindset, then they're going to be able to be really upfront with you as far as these are the other factors that we're considering. And so asking the admissions counselor, hey, we're trying to determine whether this is a good idea to do test optional or not. They're your advocates. They're there to help you through this process. I've had admissions counselors in the last few weeks. One admissions counselor advised one of my students there was a special honors college program that they thought that the student might be qualified for because of their grades and other things, but the test score was holding the student back. So this admissions counselor said, I really would say that you should apply test optional to open up your options a little bit wider. And this is coming from a school that has really embraced test optional. So the admissions counselor would say, hey, it's going to help you if you apply test optional, you're going to have more opportunities. I had another admissions counselor where I asked the student had not submitted test scores, they were accepted, and then they did have a good test score. And so the student said, hey, I'm wondering if I should submit this for scholarship. And the admissions counselor said, oh yeah, you should. You're going to get more scholarship that way. So this is a really fair and normal conversation to ask an admissions counselor at a test optional school. They're helping to guide you through this process. And if there's some ambiguity or you're uncertain or your student's uncertain, really encourage you to have your student have a conversation with your admissions counselor because they're going to be your best resource in navigating the test optional question. So let's just say you've made the decision, your students made the decision, okay, we're going to do test optional. I'm going to apply as a test optional candidate to a college or university. What are they going to look at besides my grades? How is the school going to determine that, that they know me, that they understand who I am as an applicant? So this is a survey that the colleges and universities took in 2019 when before test optional really hit the scene in a big time way, and college admissions offices reported these are the items that are considerable or of moderate importance when we're reviewing application files. So this is from admissions offices from all over the country. The top thing that they're looking at is grades in courses. So yes, we want to take a look at the grades. And then we want to take a look at some grades in college prep courses. So grades in honors courses, the strength of curriculum. Have you taken all 4 years of math, or have you taken several years of science above and beyond the requirement? Like what does that look like? So they're looking at that. Admissions test scores was number 4. But if you take that out, let's look at some other things that they're considering. A counselor recommendation that really speaks to the student and how they are at school and in the school community. An essay or a writing sample, a teacher recommendation, extracurricular activities, demonstrated interest, work, interview, portfolio. So there's all these other factors that colleges and universities that are test optional can consider when they're looking at a student. So what does that even mean? What can I highlight as a student? And we'll talk about these 5 areas that a student can highlight. And when I say highlight, it's not going to necessarily be I'm typing this in on my application. Some of these items will be specifically noted on the application, but let's talk about some ways to make sure that a student is able to highlight who they are, who God made them. Grades, outside involvement, intangible skills, special skills, and progress. So what does that mean? Grades in high school. That was the most important first look at a student is what are your grades in high school? If you have a younger student, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, I think it's good to play to your strengths as a student. If I really excel in math and science, and maybe English or world language is not where I excel the most, then maybe I'm going to play to my strengths and take some honors classes in those math and science classes, and just do maybe on level or regular classes for the areas that are not my strongest. It doesn't necessarily mean you take the very most challenging classes in every area, because that's maybe not how we're built. So play to your strengths. Then uphill trends. Sometimes 9th graders have a hard time adjusting to high school. So maybe as a 9th grader, my year started out hard because I was excited to be in high school and I got involved with an awful lot of things. And all of a sudden, my grades weren't so great. I figured that out maybe about halfway through the year or into my sophomore year. And now I have an upward trend. So if a student started out slow or started out with maybe not as strong as they'd like to be, are there some uphill trends? That's something that can be noted. That's something that admissions officers recognize. It's something that students can point out about themselves. So are there some uphill trends? And then when it comes to grades in high school, what's time management look like as a student? How has the student been able to balance challenging courses or a full load of courses along with playing a sport? Has that student been able to manage time well? And if the case is yes, like this student has really thrived in like, oh, I can handle lots of things at the same time. We'll talk about how to make sure that stands out in the college application. So grades, involvement outside of school. Sometimes students will say like, I don't think I really do a lot, or I just do school sports, or I just volunteer. What colleges are looking for in most cases is, besides being in the classroom, have you done a couple of things? How have you spent your time? So it might be a school sport, it might be an outside of school sport, it might be an individual sport. So athletics, that's a great way to show, to highlight who you are as a student. Volunteer service, has your student been involved in maybe volunteer work with your church or your community? Have they spent some time outside of the school day investing in the lives of others? And then work. Sometimes parents and students don't realize that the the ability to hold down a job, especially if it's a boring job and you're coming to work every afternoon for 4 hours, and maybe it's minimum wage and it's not really fancy, the continuation of being involved in something like that while balancing coursework can really be an important part of the application. So sometimes students think, look, it's not that big of a deal. I work, 4 hours a day, 2 hours a day. But the ability to continue to do that and to show up on time and to balance that with other responsibilities can be helpful. So maybe there's some intangible traits. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this because an intangible trait is not something that you necessarily will list on your college application. But when you and your student are thinking about who they have become in high school, are there some real instances of time that your student was able to show integrity, a hard decision where everybody else in the class seemed to be cheating on a test and the student said, I've worked hard, I'm not going to sacrifice this, it's really important to me. So has there been times that a student has exhibited some integrity, some empathy for others, a strong work ethic, responsiveness to feedback? So I think it can be helpful as parents to talk about that type of thing. And then maybe some kindness, special skills, art, music, athletic, or other, and then some progress. Are there ways to show progress that the student has made? I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So we talked about how can you show yourself off as a student? How do you communicate this information? Some schools will have a resume where you can list extracurricular activities, of course. There might be short answers where you're able to put into verbiage, maybe an example of some of those intangible skills. An essay is a great way to highlight that, and then follow up conversations with your admissions counselor. Scholarships, test optional schools have come up a way with awarding scholarship without test scores. And some students might say, we'll accept you without a test score, but we'd love for you to update your scores for scholarship opportunities. So in most cases, I think it's a good idea to continue to think about testing. Paying attention to the school's testing policy, they vary from school to school, and then have your student communicate with the admissions counselor. They are the experts in this. Some resources that I like to use, and I believe they're in the chat, fairtest.org has a really accurate and up-to-date listing of the colleges and universities nationwide that are test optional. And then compassprep.com, if you go into their college profiles, they have a searchable database. It's really easy. That'll bring up test optional policies, how long they've been in place, if they're temporary or extended. All right, so I think we have some time for questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Caryn, for sharing this information. Sometimes it's just hard to figure out if test optional is an option, and I think you've helped us navigate that. There are a few questions, so I'll just throw them out to you and you can let us know. Okay. One of the questions is around the timeline, like when would I know if I should submit or not? Like, what if I apply and then you mentioned a student that later was like, maybe I should submit, but what does that timeline look like and how should we make that decision?
So I think the timeline, if you've maybe done some testing into, some students will do it spring of junior year, some early as fall of junior year, and then going into senior year. Before you're submitting the application, you're reviewing the test optional policy and having a conversation with the admissions counselor. So a lot of times when you're filling out an application, if it's a test optional school, you will be asked to say, am I test optional? Yes or no. So before hitting submit on your application, having that conversation to determine whether you're going to be test optional or not. There are some schools that'll say, hey, if you are test optional, and it'll be in their verbiage on their website, if you're test optional and you decide that you'd like to submit test scores, you're allowed to do that. There are some schools that say, once you make that decision, you don't get to change your mind. So it goes back to reading each school's test optional policy, but generally you'll determine if you're going to apply test optional before you hit your application, before you submit your application in the fall of your senior year.
Great. The other question that we have is, at a test optional school, do you, in your opinion, would a high test score override a lower GPA? Like if I have a low GPA and I've applied to a test optional school, is this the kind of thing I would submit to show that maybe I should be admitted?
So a higher test score can help you. It sometimes if it's your test score is super high and your GPA is C's and D's, that could be cause for concern or at least an explanation to say, okay, these don't seem to match up. There could very well be a reason for that. Let's talk about what that reason is. So a high test score could help, but if my transcript has all D's on it and I have a perfect ACT, that's going to be a cause for an admissions counselor to want to dive a little bit deeper in. And maybe I had a really rough high school experience and there could be explanation for that, but it's not going to be a magic band-aid to fix that. It will be a conversation.
Yeah, thank you. In my experience as a former vice president for enrollment, I would say your advice to reach out to the school and ask some of these genuine questions is great, and will help families figure out what they're supposed to do. And what happens if I change my mind? What if I submitted a test score and now I'm panicking that I don't want it to be?
And I just talked to a admissions officer at a school out of state today, and the student was worried. I submitted my test scores. I didn't mean to. Can I change my mind? And she said, yeah, she just needs to send us an email saying that I'd like to change it. So it doesn't have to be a scary thing. Colleges want to work with students and help them present their best self. So they're not looking to punish you. They're just looking to help the student in this process because it is stressful.
Great. Thank you so much, Caryn. We really appreciate your time and you sharing your expertise with the group. Thank you to the guests, your participants for showing up tonight. And hopefully this was important and helpful information to them. We do invite you to move over to the virtual fair and explore the booths of the many different Christian colleges and universities that are there. There are reps there waiting to talk to you. There's a chat feature. If they don't get right back to you, they certainly will. But as we mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the virtual fair will be open the rest of the month, but tonight is the last time the reps will be available for live discussion. So we appreciate all of you for being here tonight, and have a great evening.